I used to look at those ads that said an army of one and wonder about that. And I realized that I was in a different army. When I left school at 15 with a barely uh, cobbled together education, St. Wilfrid's Catholic School, and I had a little job. Told this part of the story before, but I had a little job in a clothing manufacturer's for a little while, very short time, because I then trained to be a coal miner, and the coal mining was it. I didn't actually work as a full time coal miner. I did my training, which was down the pit at the uh, Robin Hood pit, and we used to do a couple of days a week at college learning about how a coal mine works, and we would go down the pit and experience. You've got to understand that we're being we're being instructed by hardened old men who have been in the coal mines all their lives. The coal mines used to be a good job. I remember thinking that I was quite lucky to get a job as a coal miner, and I entered the training with great enthusiasm. I was very interested at college. Uh, I was able to study, but I'm not very good at I'm not very good at behaving, and I didn't get my books and my study books and my drawings of stuff that was in the pit. The various pieces of equipment. We'd be asked to do a rough drawing, and I did that in a book, which I would love to have had now. Now, the other thing is that back then, people actually had to have a camera in order to take photographs. It was the old-fashioned way. You put a roll of film into the back of the camera, then you sealed it up and you made sure that no light got into it, and then you took a series of photographs on that roll, and the roll spread out between one little cog and another. So it went from this cog over to this cog, and when it was successfully transferred, you took it in and had it developed, and then you had this great surprise of having a look at the photographs. Not like now. Back then, events were not spontaneously filmed. So if a cop uh, abused a civilian, it was not captured on film. It was very rarely. Whereas now, it's not just that everybody has a phone; it's that everybody has a camera. In fact, we are criticised for not being high tech. Right now, I'm filming myself. I'm videoing myself on an Oppo. It's not top of the range. It's good enough, but occasionally I think maybe even right now it will get out of sync. It will also reverse things, so what you're looking at as the left becomes the right. People ask me, why am I driving a right-hand drive Raptor, which of course I'm not. Well, it was a great experience because it showed me how some men earn their living. Now we've heard a lot about toxic masculinity, and toxic masculinity, for my money, was invented by feminists. It was invented by people who, it's funny that they really want to see a man cry, but then they'll despise him for being weak. So it's a no-win situation for a man. My own personal experience is never let a woman see you cry. Don't ever do it. You need to be strong. And we need to remember how to be men, because it seems to me a lot of the time that we've forgotten. So we can continue to open the door for a lady, and we can let her go first, and we can open the door of the car and make sure that she's seating comfortably, unless you're married, and then you've been doing it so many times that it becomes automatic. But given that she doesn't open the door for you to get in the car, so anyway, that's by the by. But these men that I encountered in the pit, what would happen is that if a man suffered an injury, many miners lose the thumb. As soon as you lose the opposing thumb, you can't grip anything. How can you? Look at what happens. Look at what happens when you hold a cup. Just imagine that you don't have that thumb. You're really disabled. So they give them jobs as instructors, and these are men of immense experience. And don't forget, I was born in 1939. So when I got to what age would I be when I went into the pit? I went in when I was 15. It's just a few years after the war had ended. War ended in, what was it, 44, 45, not exactly sure. It was a bit of a mess at the end there, wasn't it? Because Germany surrendered, but the Japanese did not. So, but from the end of the war, it was not long before I actually went in at 15 into the pit. Now, the men that went before me had been in the pit for most of their lives, and that meant throughout the war. Back then, there were some incredible movies made about mining disasters where the women would wait outside the pit head and they'd find out whether their man had or brother had lived or died. There were several things which are like high crimes if you went into the pit. If you were a smoker and you accidentally kept matches, in other words, the sulfur, the redhead wooden stick. Nobody had a lighter then. It was not so common for the common man. They would have matches. My father smoked daily, one after the other, if he could afford it, and he always lit his cigarette with a match. If you were found to have a match on you when you went down the pit, it would usually, I think, be instant dismissal, because it could cost the lives of many and do incredible damage, because there would be gas. That was back then when they still had canaries, and they also still had pit ponies. They were just being phased out. These were little ponies that spent their lives down the pit, down 1,000 feet or so, and they lived their lives down there, and they pulled these tubs around. By the time that I saw the pit, I was actually trained to be on haulage, so I would have to be able to put one like this, and then another, and they would go, and they would hooked up between one, we called them tubs. We would hook them up, so you would have this kind of thing, like this, and you would have to one-handed put your hand under the tub, so you'd be taking hold of the tub and going down like this, and you would get the hook on your thumb and the loop on your fingers, and you would pop it in like that. A lot of guys would live dangerously once they got used to the job. And when one tub came up from the coal face, this is in, you have like main roads, and in the main road is where the coal would come up from the face, and it would come up on trolleys, on rails, and to get the two uncoupled or coupled, as the case was, they would actually lean in between the two, in between these two things, which if they didn't get out in time, they would go like that. But they'd lean in, get the hook and get the loop and slot it in. And they lived like that. Familiarity brings that kind of skill. During our time, obviously, I'm 15 years old, and everybody, all of the other kids, I see it now. I didn't see it then, of course, because at 15 you're a big guy, aren't you? I remember when we used to play cowboys. I noticed that the cowboys on the movies, they called each other boys. Hey, come on, boys, let's get going. But of course, young boys call each other men. Come on, men, when we were pretending. Well, of course, we weren't men. And we had to get used to the idea, which very few people have experienced, total darkness. Just your hand like this in front of your face. So when you got to the pit head, when you were on your way down for a training session, for a day in the pit, you would get a battery. And the battery was something like this size. And it hooked on the back of your belt. So when you got to the pit and started your training, they gave you what we called a boiler suit, a work suit, and a strong leather belt, which the battery used to hook onto for the light, and the light would go on here like this on your helmet, which you always wore, of course. Now, the guys who taught us, and then, well, trying to get it into some kind of order, we would go down in a cage, but not the fancy cages that you see in America where they have a big gate and it comes across and it's only guys standing in. No, we went down in the tiered, on which were in effect on many floors, so that when we were on haulage, the cage would come down and we would put two tubs into that, and then on a signal it would go down further or up further, and two more tubs, up further, two more tubs, and these are all pushed around like so. It's a very physical job. Well, the men that would take us down would make sure that we knew no matches, no cigarettes, nothing like that, no lighters, nothing, and make sure that we knew that. And then we would file in to the place that was made for two tubs and stand on the lines which took those tubs in. And then we would, when everything was loaded up, we would just drop. Well, when you drop down that pit, you are literally hanging in the middle of a huge shaft, and you're standing in there holding onto a rail in a cage that is made for two tubs. So there would be 6 or 7 of you in that space. You would be able to look out and you would see the tube, the shaft that you were going down, and it would take a long time. Now, I say that I entered it with enthusiasm, but actually, when I started to really see what was happening, you're going down so very far, and I'd watched many movies about the tragedy of pits that had suffered a fire or a cave-in. Now, before I went down the pit, I didn't realise what the cave-in was really about. But when we got down there, I would be seeing they were still using wooden pit props. They were still there. And they put the pit prop up like this between the floor and the overhead, the ceiling, which is dug out of rock. But Mother Nature didn't always agree with the way that that was done. And if it was not done properly, it would take more and more and more pressure until finally that wooden pit prop would give way, and it would be fired like a bullet, and quite often would kill people. We then went down shafts which were no longer in use or had been taken out as training areas, and the idea is that these tunnels are made up with the little railway lines for the tubs and little areas where we would have to turn the tubs, and we would practice doing that under the supervision of this hardened miner. And you could always tell the ones that had been in all of their lives because they would show injuries, and some of them would have scars on the face and on the head, and strangely on the chin like this. And because they'd been down the pit, you've got to remember, if there's a fall in, the men may be down there, depending, they can be down there for several days and not actually know whether they're going to get out. So one of the things that we had to do as trainees was at these tiny tunnels where the tubs were that we could practice turning around. Part of the training was that we would sit safely so we're not blundering around in the dark. We would sit and the instructor would order the light to be turned out. And a lot of people can't take that and they would freak out. So if they can't do that, of course, you can't be freaking out if something goes wrong and you're in total darkness. You have to know what is happening. So they would find their way to another job. I completed my training, but I did find out about some of the things that had happened. And in the Robin Hood pit, you can imagine a load of 15-year-old kids, and we're all telling the ghost stories in the dark, and about when men were trapped for days. Thing is that when you're trapped for days and it's completely sealed, the air begins to run out and you eventually suffocate. So they have a limited time to get to you, and sometimes they may not know whether you're alive. So one of the things that these trapped miners used to do would be to get a rock or something of metal if they could, and they would tap on the metal, and as long as the rescuers could hear tapping, they would know that there was life. Now, I lived through these actual fall-ins, where there might be an explosion. If it's gas, and it's so easy for that to happen. If there's a gas leak, if it's hit a pocket of gas, that's where the canaries, who were extremely sensitive, so they would have them in the cages, and if they saw that the canary dropped over, they would know that they were in trouble. The other thing is that they might have a flood in. So there were a lot of great, very dangerous things. Us kids sitting there thinking about this never dreamed, of course, that, well, it couldn't happen to us, could it? But I have to admit that the more that I went down that shaft, every time we sank there, I did think about that. We went round to many other, as a training exercise, we went round to other pits where they were much more advanced than ours, that they would have transport down the main thoroughfare, that miners would be able to go in like a mini train that would be able to take them to the face and save time. And on one occasion, we went to the face, to the coal face, which is where you're working. And back then, when we got up to the face, we were on our knees and we were watching. They had they did have machines, but they also had guys who were working on the pick. And that's how they would be doing it. And I realized that this was not going to be a life that I would want. Coincidentally, my father, without my knowing, had written to the bandmaster of the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, which is a famous Scottish regiment. Originally, the original Red Line. I know that in America they also called a particular group of Marines the Red Line. But the original story of the Red Line was that the soldiers of the Red Line were so tough. And this is the actual story, the legend, that instead of being shoulder to shoulder in battle, they would be able to space them apart because they were very fierce guys. That's when, touching on my last video when I talked about prejudice, that's when I first found out that I was English. I hadn't really thought about it up to then. I'm actually Irish, but I'm English born. So my heritage is Irish. I never ever saw any of my relatives because my family, my mother and father, were it was a mixed marriage. One was Catholic and one was Protestant. And to the Irish, that was a real no-no. So he wrote away and he asked the bandmaster if he would said, will you take my son? He's very interested in music, but he doesn't play anything. And the bandmaster wrote back and said, we'd be very happy to take your son. Yes, I bet they would. And they did take me. So the day that I was supposed to start work on haulage at the Bradford pit, these pits are no longer in existence, I don't think. There were so many of them all dotted around. A lot of people lived close to a pit. Well, instead of going into the pit full time, it was almost like a rescue, and my parents took me to I passed the test. Obviously it was a very low test. You didn't have to be very educated. You were going into the infantry. So I passed it. Even I passed it. And I remember my parents taking me to Exchange Station in Manchester, and they stood there and put me on the train and waved goodbye to me. And I left on a train, on a line of carriages that was pulled by an enormous steam locomotive. And for the life of me, I can't find out whether that was what engine spotters back then would call a namer. It could have been the Flying Scot, which became a very famous train, very famous locomotive. And I travelled alone the entire way because there was no corridor in the carriages. You got in the carriage and that was it. And I travelled alone, and I remember travelling over the Great Forth Bridge, which was for some kid from Manchester who had lived all his life up to then in a very poor area of Moss Side, if you want to look it up. Some people will actually know these. I lived in Cowsby Street, Moss Side. That was where I left my family from there, was from Cowsby Street in Moss Side. Moss Side is famous because of the Manchester City football ground being in Moss Side. In my family home, on Saturdays, we could hear the crowds at the ground of Manchester City, and we could hear them roaring. But I've gone on for too long. I hope that you've stayed with me and found something of interest. These are what I've grown to think of as my late night meanderings. Please do share if you think of people who may enjoy this particular look at history from a first-person perspective. This was in Manchester, really just after the war. I lived the first of my childhood up to the age of 5 during the war. That's another video. Bye for now.